Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Well, I'm back today with my great good friend and my favorite all-time polymath, Dr. Jay Richards, who's an expert in so many things. And Jay has written a soon-to-be-published book called Fight the Good Fight, How an Alliance of Faith and Reason Can Win the Culture War. And he's writing it with James Robinson. Jay, you've got a new gig. Mm-hmm. You're now at Heritage. And we talked about summarizing your title, but I really want to do justice to the whole new title.
Oh, no.
Director Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in Religious Liberty and Civil Society.
Yeah, that's a paragraph, isn't it? So.
Well, I don't think it does you justice. I mean, this is 5 or 6 times we've been talking together.
Yeah, at least.
The first time we talked was my second show, and we did it out in Rappahannock County.
Yes.
And the great segment was when your daughters came on, and they were homeschooling.
Yeah.
And I was very interested in what it was like to be homeschooled, and they were fabulous. Now, I understand one of your daughters is where?
She is at the Heritage. So my older daughter is at the Heritage Foundation. She's a research associate in the Simon Center, which is different from the William Simon Fellow. It's a different Simon, and writing on lots of really interesting and somewhat controversial topics. And actually, my younger daughter, who is a college student, is interning at Heritage this summer, actually. So they probably are not going to like the fact that I mentioned this, but
well, that's all right. Yeah, well, I'm proud of you, but I'm really proud of them. It's great. They're charming. It's great to see how well they've worked out.
Well, homeschooling, it pays dividends. They didn't believe it at the time, but turns out you can have a good and normal and flourishing life.
Absolutely. Well, Jay's book is a big book. It's a short book, but it covers everything that needs to be covered in the fight for our liberty, and how faith and reason seem to have been shoved out of the public square. We can't cover everything in the book, so I thought what we do is cover just a couple of, I think, really essential things that we all need to know more about. The first one is Jay's written an article recently which relates to the book. The title is Why States Must Define Sex Precisely. Now, the question we're all asking is, why on earth are we talking about the definition of what's a man and what's a woman? And we're going to get into that. We're going to do this in 2 segments today. The first one we'll talk about men and women. Mm-hmm. And then the second segment is something I've covered and Jay's covered in the past together and separately, climate change. And in particular, I want to get into the notion that radical climate change, it is a radical agenda. You begin to realize how anti-human it is. And I think just as importantly, it totally throws the habitat and species protection cares under the bus in the interest of wind and solar. And you look at what it's doing to habitat and species, I think climate change is going to deserve a second look.
Absolutely.
So, Jay, let's start with why on earth I know why, but
yeah.
Anyway, pick it up from there.
Yeah. Why do we need to define male and female? Well, everyone that has not been hiding under a rock knows that our institutions are now almost entirely suffused and saturated with something we'll call gender ideology. And gender ideology is just this idea that a person's true identity is this internal subjective sense they have of their gender, called a gender identity, rather than the fact that we are free bodily sexed beings. So instead of male and female, right, as a biological reality, we are these things called gender identities, and sex is a mere social construct called sex assigned at birth. So that's gender ideology. It's worked its way into all of our institutions, whether it be school or media or now governmental institutions. In fact, it's a high priority, if not the top priority, of the Biden administration. So what the Biden administration has been in the process of doing is redefining sex where it occurs in federal law and regulations to include gender identity. This is the key thing. So sex didn't need to be defined before, say in Title IX, the law some 50 years ago, that guarantees women sort of equal treatment in federally funded programs, high schools and colleges, things like that. It's about making sure women have equal opportunity in colleges. Well, the people that wrote and passed Title IX didn't think to define what a woman is. They didn't think to define what male and female are because it wasn't contested. You don't bother to define terms when everybody knows what it is. Well, it's now contested. And so if sex can include or be a gender identity under Title IX, that means that a man who wants to compete in female sports and is denied that will have his civil rights violated simply if he identifies as a woman. So it doesn't require that he be a woman to compete against women in women's sports. It simply requires that he identify as such. And how do you figure that out? Well, if he says he's a woman, then he's a woman. It's that simple. That's gender ideology. On the other hand, if you think, well, no, we segregated sports in the first place because males and females are different, and it would be unfair and unjust for women, certainly in high school and absolutely in college, to have to compete against males. We just wouldn't have significant female sports. That's just one example of this.
Well, let's you talked about gender construct.
Yes.
I mean, construct, an interesting word. The French gave us that, didn't they? This is back into sort of French, radical French.
Absolutely. This is
deconstruction.
I won't just blame the French, the Germans, and the Austrians.
That's right.
Yeah,
the
so
Germans
we've got critical theory in here, and we've got some French postmodern.
So this is part of a mosaic of a deconstruction to deconstruct every institution in society.
Queer every category and this is the verb.
What do you mean? That's the verb. What do you mean queer?
To queer, that is to queer everything. This is queer theory. So here I'm not using, that's not the pejorative. That's the verb that is used by the ideologues. To queer is to decenter or destabilize our categories of reality. So you're thinking sex, you're thinking boy and girl. What they're thinking is that this internal sense of gender identity and mere stereotypes that have been imposed upon us by doctors, namely sex assigned at birth. So no sex, rather we're going to have gender identity and sex assigned at birth. This is part of the program. You can see the same kind of thing happening certainly in other disciplines.
And they started out other disciplines.
Yeah.
This started at deconstructing literature, Shakespeare, whatever, and it was all, everything, the meaning of text.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everything, nothing had any reality. Everything was text.
Yes.
And it was, and in particular, something like Shakespeare was just to show the white male power hierarchy and how that was oppressive.
That's
and
right.
every single one of Shakespeare plays, regardless whether it's a comedy or tragedy, was to drive home that hierarchical agenda.
That's right. And there's a mix here, Bill, because if you want to sort of reduce Marxism to something called conflict theory. So let's say that all the kind of varieties of Marxism, at bottom, what they posit is that you really can only properly explain social reality, human beings in society and in culture, in terms of a conflict between two primary groups. It might be the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. It might be whites versus blacks, gay versus straight, male versus female. That's the kind of conflict theory. Marx
so when we get at the radical
economics.
division, I want to keep you keep going. I just want to. So if they define it as conflict between two groups, oppressed and oppressors, that really kind of gets at why we're so divided right now.
Absolutely,
is that everything's been deliberately bifurcated.
Absolutely, and it's a cartoonish type of sociology to imagine, one, that conflict is really the only powerful explanatory category, and two, that people can be reduced to these two groupings. But of course, Marxism just said, well, the most meaningful conflict is the conflict over the economic relations, the owners versus the workers, right? So-called cultural Marxism with Gramsci and the critical theory. They said,
Antonio Gramsci,
Antonio
1920s,
Italian Marxist,
exactly.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And basically said, well, the real stuff in society are these cultural institutions. And so what cultural Marxism is, despite the media's efforts to say that it's an anti-Semitic slur, it's not. It just describes this turn in the kind of sort of Marxist school away from focusing on economic conflict and toward social and racial and other kinds of cultural conflicts. Gender ideology is an inheritor of that intellectual tradition, plus French postmodernism, which with the focus on language and text, and then this kind of radical relativism in which all you have, in a sense, are these social constructs. You don't have a real thing, like you don't have a real biology that describes things. And then what follows relativism, because nobody's really a relativist, they're just a relativist about your views, is a kind of radical totalitarian spirit, right? So if everything's just power plays and language games, then somebody's going to have power and it's going to be arbitrary. It might as well be us. And so that's the kind of, you combine that. So imagine critical theory and cultural Marxism, French postmodernism, and then the totalitarian spirit that always follows relativism because it's not stable. That's where you get critical race theory, gender ideology, queer theory. There's a dozen of these, and you can identify them either because they have the word theory in them, or because if they're in an academic setting, they have the word studies after them.
Studies.
So you don't have physics
studies,
but you'll have women's studies or gender studies.
So explain the queer verb again.
Yes,
queer
and so of course, queer
means
to queer is to destabilize or to decenter categories, essentially. So queering sex would be to say, okay, there's no stable categories. Queering consent or queering the distinction between adults and children, that's the sort of cutting edge, right? That these categories we have are oppressive.
Well, next it's going to
constructs.
become between animals and humans.
Yeah, I think that's probably already here. And since the animals can't fight back, they've already kind of frankly moved. They don't have a representative. And so they've moved very quickly to the barrier between children and adults.
So we set the sex issue, and I do want to dig into the distinctions, into the context of deconstructing, destroying all the Western institutions.
Yeah, and not just Western institutions, just the deliverances of natural reason. So, male and female, for instance. You don't have to be a Christian, you don't have to be a Westerner to understand that they're males and females. This is a simple deliverance of reason. And of course, for the gender ideologues, these are, sort of part and parcel of Western oppressive structures. But that shows you how bad the argument is that they would attribute even things that everyone in all times and places knows and understands, that they would disparage that as, Western logocentric logic chopping oppressive categories. This is not serious philosophy. This is certainly not serious science.
The whole cultural Marxism is a power agenda. It's all about power.
It's a cultural wrecking ball. And when I talk and give lectures on this, people often say, well, that seems strange. Because you can immediately think of contradictions in the view. It seems incoherent. And I say, look, don't imagine this is going to be some tight philosophical system. It's not even like traditional Marxism in that way, which, Marx thought was true science. It's a cultural wrecking ball. That's what these are. These are the utopians use for whatever tools are at hand to destroy the present order, and then they imagine that whatever their imagined utopia, that will somehow take its place.
Well, James Lindsay.
Yes, absolutely.
Good friend. He's fantastic.
Yes.
And this is all about power.
He is, and Lindsay is actually probably the if not one of, then the best sort of analyst of these things. He's really, really good and gets way down in the weeds. But honestly, for people that want to get down in the weeds, listening to Lindsay, you can't better than that.
He's in the weeds.
But we love it. That's the reality.
We need to do it. He's done the work to get to this.
And the reason this is hard to fight or resist is because it's protean, right? It's always constantly moving and changing. The people on the other side will claim, well, you don't understand us, or how dare you label us with a term. They're doing that with gender ideology right now. How dare you use that term?
Well, the thing about all this, and I find, I'm a business guy essentially, and spent a lot of time in private equity, finance, Wall Street, et cetera. So I tend to be very practical, I guess. Did some time as a CEO.
Yeah.
And I remember the joke. Bill Cosby's now since been, I guess. Anyway, this is the Bill Walton Show, and I'm about to tell I hope a good joke. I'm here with Jay Richards.
Involving Bill Cosby.
Involving Bill Cosby. We're talking about sexual differences between men and women, so this could give me. Anyway, so Bill Cosby, I'm listening to his album, from the early 60s when he was quite funny. And I guess he went to Hofstra or one of the.
Yeah, Hofstra.
He was a football player.
Or in Temple. Did he have
Temple.
A
He went to
Temple?
Hofstra was the enemy.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he was telling a story about being in a philosophy class at Temple. And the professor said, "Why is there air?" And everybody's supposed to be thinking about that. And Bill said, well, I don't know, blow up footballs, basketballs. I kind of find myself in that category that we're having to talk about the sexual difference between men and women and what is the distinction. But that's part of the power agenda.
Absolutely.
It's part of the power agenda, and it matters how these are defined because of the laws we have.
That's exactly right. It's absolutely crucial. And because the difference between male and female is now contested, states need to define it in state law because they use the terms, right? If you're in the state of Montana or Oklahoma, they've used male, female, men, women, they've used the terms. You'd be surprised that almost no states have actually nailed these down tight. But here's the sort of more frustrating thing is everyone tacitly knows what men and women are, but coming up with your tacit understanding is not the same as coming up with a tight definition that captures the thing, sort of captures reality at its joints. And so it's actually much harder to define male and female than the average person would think. And so very often, if, say, state legislators are going to come up with a bill to do this, they will wander into the traps set for them by the opposition by failing to define these things precisely.
So there's two definitions that the subjective notions are: one, internal sense of gender called gender identity. And then the second is sex assigned at birth.
Right. Those are categories provided by gender ideologues as substitutes for what we think of as biological sex. That is, that sex is this thing that's just you find out there in the world that can actually be accurately described. They say, no, we have this subjective internal sense of gender. That's your gender identity. And then what sex is really just something that's assigned to us at birth based upon sort of anatomical stereotypes that doctors apparently learned in medical school and then sort of imposed upon us. And so this is the sort of key thing to understand. Gender ideology denies the reality, or at least the adequacy of describing human beings as male and female in biological terms. That sounds crazy and extreme to people, so they think that can't be what's happening. That is exactly what's happening. It's why they are loath to use the word sex. They will talk about sex assigned at birth instead.
So, but what they hang their hat on here is in part the fact that as boys and girls are born, there's a certain percentage of them that are born with some sort of deformity.
Some ambiguous.
It's an infinitesimal amount. I think it's like 0.018%.
That's right, 0.018.
1 in 100,000 or 1
Yeah,
in
it's
10,000.
very small. It's a handful of kids that have what are properly called, they have disorders of sexual development that can either be just disorders that happened when they were developing in their mother's womb, or it can be a chromosomal abnormality. And so what gender ideologues want to do is confuse you so that people are vaguely aware that there are these disorders of sexual development that seem to people to be exceptions to the way we normally identify males and females, will make you think that the idea of a gender identity is somehow related to this. It's not. And then confuse everyone so that suddenly they're actually denying that sex is binary in humans, which is just insane. It's not true. Every biologist knows it's not true. And yet now we've even got official scientific organizations like Scientific American falling for this stuff and actually perpetuating this nonsense. And so you can see why it's really important that we nail this down. It's important for the benefits, especially of women in bathrooms, women in prisons, women in sports. All are at risk because of this. And so those are a few of the reasons we have to do this.
Well, who are the thought police on this? Because we have our most recent Supreme Court justice in her hearing saying she couldn't define a woman.
Because she wasn't a biologist, right? Now, that was a tell, because she implied that, well, if you were a biologist, you would know how to define it.
Do you think she was that clever?
No, she's not. No, and I assume she's clever in her area. She was clever enough to know that this was a trap, right? Because either she says, well, there are no women. Women are just people who identify as women. Then they'd say, okay, well, so if a man had applied for this position and identified as a woman, would he be a woman justice? She couldn't say that, right? But so she couldn't define it in one way, but she couldn't define it biologically because then she'd be violating the canons of gender orthodoxy. And so she was acutely aware of that. And so that's why Matt Walsh's film is so great, because he realizes asking
Matt Walsh,
the question.
explain Matt
Yeah,
Walsh.
Matt Walsh, the Daily Wire, of course,
Right.
is this great documentary, What is a Woman? Where he just asks lots of people this question. Everybody's seen it, I assume. It's amazing, but precisely because it forces people onto the horns of one or the other dilemma that they don't want to be on if they're committed to gender ideology, or at least if they don't want to offend the gender ideologues, which is what I assume we had in this hearing before the Supreme Court, is that, of course, the judge, now Justice, she knows what a woman is, obviously. She knows she's a woman, but she knew she couldn't clearly answer the question without, getting gored on one of the horns of the dilemma.
So if we stick with if they prevail, and there's a blurred distinction between men and women, whatever you feel you are that day is what you are, what are the practical implications of that?
The practical implications are that if a man is a rapist and is raped and murdered women that's in life in prison, in a men's prison, identifies as a woman, he will have to be moved to women's prisons. That has to be done. If a boy is 13 and his teacher tells him he might be born in the wrong body and he's really a girl, then he's really a girl, according to his gender identity, then the proper way to help him medically would not be to help him adjust to his bodily reality. It would be to transform his social surroundings and his body to conform to his internal gender identity. It requires that any male identifying as a woman be allowed to compete in women's sports, on and on and on, women's bathrooms, women's locker rooms, all the things that we intuitively understand. We know why we separate men and women in bathrooms. We know why we separate men and women's sports. It's based on justice and a recognition of these fundamental differences between men and women. That's being denied here. And so basically any public institution for which the distinction between men and women matters is going to be destroyed if the agenda of the gender ideologue succeeds.
Well, then I'm just pondering. So,
You're responding like any good boomer normally responds to this conversation, right? It's just sort of stunned silence. Yes.
Well, I can't believe where we are.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I can tell you, Bill, I've noticed
and by the way,
yeah.
one thing I was thinking about whether I should tell this story. I read something. I'm forced to read all this stuff because of this. Right. I'm trying to do this show, and I'm trying to find interest. Well, the actual transition from biological female to biological male to purportedly female is not very satisfying physically. No. I mean, they don't quite get all the equipment.
You can't do this. So you create at best partial facsimiles.
And
right?
the reverse is true
and the
as
reverse.
well.
You can chop things off. You can cut parts of your body off and try to create a facsimile of other things. I'm trying not to be too graphic, but we can't reproduce these organs, needless to say.
So let's talk about what the correct
yes.
definition is.
Okay. So here's the key thing. We don't define sex in terms of chromosomes. For some reason, everybody thinks that's how you define it. They think, oh, this is all easy, XX, XY. No, that is what XX and XY are, is those are kind of part of the pathways under normal development by which sex is developed. But we all knew what sex was and could recognize it before we knew about chromosomes, right? And so you define sex, and we should understand sex in terms of, biologically, you'd say the phenotypes. So these particular phenotypes, these not genotypes, right? But
and what's pheno mean?
I think of the body structure.
Okay.
That's the best way to think of this, right? And so what sex is it's the reproductive strategy that mammals and many other organisms, including humans, have developed that we have for reproducing. And so it refers to these two body structures or body systems and corresponding gametes. So a male is a member of the species that under normal development produces small, relatively mobile gametes called sperm and has a body structure and an endocrine system and hormonal profile that corresponds to that. The female is the member of the species that under normal development produces large, relatively immobile gametes called ova. There are exactly two. We have exactly two gametes. There's not a third one. There are no ergs. There's no spems, right? There's no third or fourth gamete. So that's why we say sex is binary in human beings. It's one or the other. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't developmental anomalies that make it more difficult to tell if someone
For
is male or
example,
female.
for example.
For example, chromosomal anomalies in which you have XXY or XYY, or you can have, believe it or not, you can have an XX male if what's the SRY gene on the Y chromosome moves over to the X chromosome. You can have an XY female. So there are exceptions that will destroy your definition. So if you're defining something, all you need to show that the definition is inadequate is to have a single counterexample. And most people, because they haven't really thought carefully about this, they vaguely remember, well, I remember the XXXY thing. That must be it. That's fairly simple. Most of the time, you could use that chromosomal screening to figure out if someone's male or female, but that's not the definition of it because there are exceptions. And so this is the sort of thing that's baffling to people. Or you might say, well, women are people that can nurse and get pregnant. Well, that's true. Only of the set of individuals called women, only women can get pregnant. And there are no men who can get pregnant and bear children. But there are women who can't bear children. So a woman that's had a hysterectomy, for instance. And so if you defined woman as every person that can have children, you're going to exclude.
Not all can.
Right, you
Okay,
can't
yeah.
do it. Either you're a female that has not gone through puberty or a woman that for various reasons can't do that. So it seems like, gosh, this is really kind of complicated, and do we need to go into this detail? Absolutely. And legislators and politicians and that people are talking about this have to
We
nail
got
this.
20 state legislatures that have worked on this.
So we have, as of today, about 20 states that have
And you're working with them.
Yes, and have restricted medical procedures for minors for so-called gender-affirming care. So cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and transition surgeries. So that's a kind of manifestation of gender ideology in pediatric medicine. But even those bills, for the most part, don't define male and female precisely. And so that's something that I've been saying for a while. States need to do this. And that you can't just define sex vaguely and say it has to do with reproduction and chromosomes or something. No, you have to say what a male is, what a female is. And it's got to be objective. It's got to be based on the facts of biology. Now, what's going to happen if this happens? Well, states will define it in one way. The federal government's going to define it under Biden in a different way. There's going to be a fight in the courts, as there is in all these things. But the fight ought to be over biological reality. And that's the fight that our side wins, because we've got biological reality on their side. They've got a weird and incoherent postmodern philosophy on theirs.
Well, and it's not just postmodern, it's mystical and mythological. I've got a friend who I like a lot, and she, very poetic, reads all these different things. And I said, I'm going to do a show on same sex or the difference between men and women. She says, oh, no, there are many cultures that have many sexes.
It's not true.
Like Central Indians, they have, or African tribes, they have many, many cultures.
No.
And my answer was, well, they may have mythologies, but those are not their realities.
Yeah,
Was that the right answer?
Sort of. But even in those cultures, they recognize males and females. They may not know biology, but everyone knows males and females. What they have is these sort of categories for, say, a man that wants to live as a woman, right? So we've always had a small set of people that are uncomfortable being their biological sex and want to present as something else.
Yeah.
And so there are a couple of cultures that even have terms for that sort of third thing. It's not a third sex. And if you ask people in that culture, they would understand that. But people, unfortunately, in the West have gotten all these terms messed up in their heads, and they think sex is the same as gender identity.
Well, the libertarian in me thinks, well, if you want to live as a female and you're male, I'm okay with that.
Well,
but we just don't need to change all our laws.
Well, this is, right. If you're an adult, and like if a man says, I want to appear as a woman, okay, are you just wanting to dress like a woman and live and let live, or do I have to pretend that you're actually a woman? Right? That's what you're saying. Okay, I'm not going to actually think you're a woman. I'm not going to lock you up in jail for doing
and don't
that.
Don't make me use the preferred pronoun.
No, exactly.
If I want to, fine, but don't.
But don't do it. You're not going to be compelled to do it.
Putting
they want to make you
all their emails.
That's right. They make you do it, and so that's what this is about. This has never been about the 1 in 100,000 adult men, for the most part, that wants to cross-dress. It's never been about drag queen shows behind closed doors, right? It's about the sexualization of children and the destruction of the reality of the sexual binary in our culture, in our language, and in our laws. That's what it's about.
Okay. Well, keep up the fight. We need to win this one.
Yeah, we do.
We know why there's air.
Absolutely. We know why it's there. And it's not just for footballs and basketballs.